Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got another 11 facts video for you, this time 11 facts about the Sega or Mega CD that you maybe didn't know. But before I begin, a very short aside. Sorry about the slight unplanned hiatus for the last 2 weeks. For those of you that didn't see my posts here on YouTube, you can thank a couple of fighting dogs who managed to give me a lovely, fairly severe bite injury. I'm fine now, I got it treated, and I'm finally back up to typing, recording game footage, and doing video stuff, so here we are. Anyway, with that out of the way, today we're going to talk about some Sega CD. And you know what? I recorded so much footage for this video that I'm going to have to do another Sega CD video in a few weeks focused on its games. But for now, it's 11 facts time. Let's get on with it. The Mega/Sega CD came out in December 1991 in Japan and October 1992 here in the US. Let's start this tale with Nintendo. You see, Nintendo had just released the Super Famicom in Japan in November of 1990. The Mega Drive had been out in Japan for about 2 years already at that point, so Nintendo, thanks to their dominant position in the prior generation, was able to bide their time a bit before releasing an updated system, and included many things like way more color, hardware gimmicks like Mode 7, a fancy sample-based sound chip, and more that the Genesis/Mega Drive just didn't have. In fact, for details, check out my 11 facts on the SNES that you maybe didn't know, linked below, because I care. Now, Sega's Genesis was doing very well here in the US and taking off in much of Europe, but was struggling mightily in Japan, where NEC had built on the success of the PC Engine and its CD-ROM add-on. Sega wasn't just going to get trampled on though, they had a plan. And that plan was to augment the Genesis with its very own CD-ROM add-on. We'll talk about the specifics of their approach in just a moment, but first let's just stick to release dates and pricing. Sega's Mega CD hit Japan in December 1991 with a price tag of 49,800 yen, or roughly equivalent to $390 at the time. And this was just about a year after the release of the Super Famicom. The Sega CD, newly named, arrived in the US in November of 1992, just about a year after the SNES here, with a price tag of $299. And suddenly, there were 2 video game systems with CD-ROM attachments on the market, which brings us to our next fact. The Sega CD was the second CD-based add-on for game systems. In the PC Engine episode of 11 Facts You Maybe Didn't Know, I covered that its CD-ROM add-on was the first ever for any game system, and the Sega CD is the second. The 2 main advantages of CD-ROM systems or add-ons at the time were storage space and the ability to play back Red Book audio, which is crystal clear CD music. Sega would add a lot of other tech to their CD system, but first I just want to talk about storage, and just how much extra storage space CDs gave over cartridges at the time. Now for the NES and Sega Master System era, most of the games released for those systems were somewhere between 128K and 512K. There were a few outliers that were bigger, and there were a bunch of older games that were smaller, especially for the NES/Famicom. Now for the 16-bit era, 512K or half a megabyte was usually pretty much the starting point for games, although there were a few that were smaller. The biggest console cartridges out there in 1991 were 8 megabits, which is 1 megabyte. Well, I guess there's one exception. Star Control had come out for the Genesis and was 12 megabits at that time. CDs could store 650 megabytes. By 1992, there were only about 154 Genesis games on the market, which came out to about 96 megabytes. The SNES, which was only about a year old at the time, had even fewer, but was still close to 150 and about 104 megabytes. There were about 700 NES games, which came out to be about 175 megabytes. There were about 300 SMS games at the time, which came out to roughly 75 megabytes. And there were also about 200 Game Boy games, which equated to about 60 megabytes. And there might have been about 300 PC Engine HuCard games at the time, and let's call that 110 megabytes. So, you notice something about all those numbers I just shot out there? They don't add up to one single CD. Every single one of the games I just described for all those platforms would fit on one CD. That's just how much CDs changed the storage paradigm. Most systems would use optical discs for decades after this. The Sega CD added some impressive hardware to the Genesis. Alrighty, let's get to the meat of the Sega CD. Actually, that sounds a little gross. Let's talk about its internal hardware. The Sega CD was a lot different from the PC Engine CD-ROM add-on. NEC had bumped up the RAM with a few different system cards, but otherwise, it primarily added storage space to the system, along with a battery backup to save games that would allow for that feature. The Sega CD, however, added a whole host of improvements to the original system that included a faster 68,000 CPU running at about 12 MHz, an ASIC to handle hardware scaling and rotation, a PCM sound chip, internal save storage, and extra RAM on top of that. It's thanks to all that hardware that we had games that looked and sounded like, well, this on the system. There was no other home system on the market at the time that could match its capabilities. Stuff like Batman Returns, Soulstar, Thunderstrike, and more really showed how the system could improve the Genesis experience. They didn't quite bring home the blazing smoothness that we would see out of Sega's arcade hardware at the time, stuff like the X and Y boards running things like Thunderblade and Galaxy Force 2, but this was about the best you could expect at home before the 32-bit era would start just a few years later. And its scaling actually worked in a way that was superior to what you would find on the Neo Geo at the time, so if you're a huge Neo Geo fan, we didn't see like a lot of driving games and stuff for the system because technically it could only shrink sprites, not enlarge them. The hardware was kind of weird in a lot of ways. And I mean, come on, just check out some of this stuff from Soulstar here. This looks pretty incredible, doesn't it? And while there were many that fairly lament that there weren't more games that took advantage of the scaling and rotation capabilities of the system, there's still a fair chunk of titles available for the platform that did actually use these features of the hardware, and some of it was really impressive for the time. There were two main models of the Sega CD, but also one not-so-main model. When the Sega CD launched, we only had one model. It had a motorized tray and sat entirely under the Model 1 Genesis unit. It also needed its own AC adapter. This model was pretty cool, but all its fancy little touches contributed to that $300 price tag at launch. And also, my particular unit and a few others had suffered from connection issues that led to games crashing and some other weird malfunctions. I know this wasn't something that just was limited to me. There were other people talking about it at the time. I had some friends that had issues that were similar as well. And in April 1993 in Japan and June 93 in the US, Sega launched the cost-reduced top-loading model of the Sega CD. I had one of these also, and I didn't have any of the same connection problems that I had experienced with the Model 1. This second model became the only model of the add-on sold shortly after its debut. And like the original, it also required its own AC adapter. And it was a lot plainer, and you just popped the top open and put a disc in and closed it, and you're off to the races. There were no fancy lights on it, there were no fancy connections or motorized trays or any of that business, but it got the job done, and it was way cheaper. These were often found for $150, and they dropped down to $100 not long after. Now, Sega did also release this little guy right here, the Sega CDX. This is a standalone unit that includes both the Genesis and Sega CD hardware. This debuted in the US in April of 1994 and went for a whopping $400 when it came out. In Europe and Japan, it was known as the Multi-Mega if you've seen it with a different name. One of the best features of the CDX is the fact that you got the Genesis and Sega CD, but you only had to use one AC adapter to power both. The CDX is pretty rare, and of course pricey if you wanted to try to track one down today. They're also known for breaking pretty easily. Despite its reputation, no, most of the games for the Sega CD were not FMV games. You might think that the Sega CD has nothing but FMV games available for it. If you think that, well, you're wrong! To this day, I still see people saying, or rather parroting, that the Sega CD had nothing but FMV games like the make-your-own-music video titles. And yeah, there's a fair amount of those. There's about 35. But that's out of about 210 or so games for the system, which means there are more than 160 non-FMV games. Now you've got a few entries in pretty much all major genres. For RPGs, we've got Lunar 1 and 2, Vey, and Eye of the Beholder, plus another 20 or so that were never translated into English officially or otherwise. For strategy RPGs, you've got Dark Wizard, Shining Force CD, and a few more Japanese entries. For fighting games, you've got Samurai Showdown, Mortal Kombat CD, Eternal Champions Challenge from the Dark Side, and Fatal Fury Special, plus a few more. For scrolling beat-em-ups, you've got Final Fight, and frankly, some lesser ones. There's plenty of platform mascot games like Sonic CD, Wonder Dog, Flink, and more. You've got a few running guns like Terminator CD and Demolition Man. There are various shooters like Android Assault / Barry Arm, Lords of Thunder, Sylpheed, and more. You've got graphic adventures like The Secret of Monkey Island, Snatcher, and The Space Adventure. And sure, there are also some games that are kind of low-effort cartridge ports, but even many of the cartridge games that were moved to Sega CD are pretty enhanced. Echo the Dolphin on Sega CD's soundtrack is sublime, and the sequel even has some video sequences with lots of info about dolphins. Spider-Man is practically a whole new game with loads more levels and things to do than the cartridge version, in addition to the animated cutscenes and a great soundtrack. You've already seen a little bit of Batman Returns, which added all the driving and vehicle sequences that were not in the cartridge version. There are so many cool games that I can only show you a fraction of what's out there in this video, and that's why I'm doing the entire separate video in a few weeks on the system. So I promise you'll get a much longer look at some of these games, and you'll get to hear a lot more of the audio if you check back when I release that video. The Sega CD had its very own sound chip. One of the main benefits of moving to the CD format, as I mentioned earlier, was the ability to play back Red Book audio, aka CD quality music with real instruments, vocals, and the like. Many Sega CD games used this to great effect, but a few did something different because, as I mentioned earlier, the Sega CD had its own PCM sound chip, the Rico RF5C164. Now the Rico chip inside the Sega CD provides 8 PCM audio channels with 8-bit depth and can play samples back at up to 32 kHz. You can usually tell which games use the chip because the samples sound way better than those on the FM chip. Some games even combine the PCM chip with the regular Genesis hardware to great effect. The music in Sylpheed extensively uses the PCM chip, for example. The in-game music is not CDDA or Red Book audio in Sylpheed. It has a few CD audio tracks on the CD, but they aren't actually used in the game. Aside from that, you can hear this sound chip in games like Final Fight with its effects, Snatcher for some of its music channels, Sonic CD for some of its music, Popful Mail for voice and some music channels. Lunar Eternal Blue uses the PCM chip for most of its voice dialogue and its music, most of which is sampled at roughly 16.28 or so kHz. So this chip was actually used quite a bit and did help Sega CD games sound a lot better than Genesis games, even if they weren't using CD quality music. And I really wish that we got to see the Sega CD a bit longer because I think there could have been some really cool things done with this sound chip. But it still was used very well in the games that used it. In South Korea, the Sega CD was known as the Aladdin Boy. It's always fun to take a look at an unusual release of a system in different regions, and the Sega Mega CD is no exception. Once again, Samsung distributed the system in South Korea, and this time it went under the name of the CD Aladdin Boy. The Model 2 Sega CD unit went under the name CD Aladdin Boy 2. And as you can see here, the visual design of the system itself does not stray far from other territories. But if you really want to be shell-shocked, try finding one of these things for sale on eBay. Just look at how much they go for. Yikes. There were multiple third-party Sega CD systems. Most gamers these days are probably already aware that Sega had licensed out its Saturn hardware to a few different companies. So we got Saturns from companies like Hitachi and JVC. Hitachi had the High Saturn, and JVC had the V Saturn. But did you know that Sega had licensed out the Genesis/MD and Sega CD technology to other companies before that? This is the Wonder Mega from JVC in Japan. If you're a fellow United Statesian like me, you may recognize this better as the XI. Now this combined unit allowed gamers to play both Genesis and Sega CD games. The downside here is the 32X wasn't designed to be hooked up to it, so you can make it work, but it doesn't fit seamlessly. You might have known about the Wonder Mega and XI, but there's one device that's a little bit rarer, and that was the Aiwa Mega CD unit released in Japan in September of '94. Now if you were around in the mid-90s, this design may look very familiar to you. It looks just like the devices that Aiwa used to sell that were sort of mini boomboxes that included a CD player and tape deck. So this has both of those, but also adds a cartridge slot at the bottom. It allowed you to play Mega Drive and Mega CD games, along with music CDs and tapes. It came with a regular, but blue, 3-button standard Mega Drive pad. And this is another unit where it's really tough to hook up a 32X, by the way, but still not impossible. Finally, we also have the Pioneer Laser Active. This wacky device by default only played Laserdiscs, and it cost about $1,000 at launch in 1993. Where the Sega CD comes into play here is you can attach various packs to give the Laser Active added functionality, such as allowing it to play PC Engine/CD games and Genesis/Mega Drive or Sega/Mega CD games. It even had a karaoke add-on pack. Now how much did each of these packs or modules cost? How about $600 each, which even in 1993 was more than the cost of a Genesis plus a Model 1 Sega CD. So even if you had a laser active, there really wasn't much point in buying a Sega pack, except for a few exclusive LD games that ran on it. Approximately 6 million Sega CD units were sold. Now, just like I mentioned earlier that people tend to dismiss the Sega CD by saying it had nothing but FMV games, they also lump it in with the 32X as a failure and the reason for Sega's downfall. And no, just no. The Sega CD isn't remotely in the same league as the 32X in terms of its success. The 32X was a bona fide flop. It sold just over 650,000 units. How many units did the Sega CD sell? Over 6 million units, or nearly 10 times as many as the 32X. As far as add-ons go for a system, that's pretty impressive and better than a whole bunch of standalone systems. I mean, the 3DO sold roughly 2 million units. The Jaguar, a few 100,000. The Virtual Boy, just over 750,000. Every variation of the Neo Geo combined sold under 1 million units. The CDI sold 1.5 million units. The PC Engine Duo, just specifically the Duo model, sold 1.9 million units. So the point here is that I don't think any reasonable person can consider an add-on that sold over 6 million units a failure. In fact, it might even be the most successful add-on ever produced in video game history. The one caveat there is there aren't reliable numbers out there for the Super Game Boy or Game Boy Player, but both are thought to have sold in the low millions. So I don't know, they might have sold more than 6 million, but Nintendo never officially released any sales numbers for those devices. So there's a chance they sold less. If you're some Nintendo insider that has actual real numbers with proof, I'd love to hear from you and see that proof in the comments. The second best-selling game for the system was Lunar: The Silver Star. Okay, you can probably all correctly guess that Sonic CD was the best-selling Sega CD title with over 1.5 million units sold. So if we remove that from the equation, what's the next highest selling game worldwide? Well, according to most of the data that I've been able to find out there, it would be Lunar: The Silver Star. Now, Lunar was a fairly early and very good RPG for the system. It wasn't quite as refined as stuff like Final Fantasy at the time, but it had an anime-inspired theme, likable characters, great music, a good story, a good combat system, nicely done cutscenes, and more. It definitely didn't show the full potential of the system and looked a bit like an early Genesis title with some extra cutscenes, but it made up for that with its many charms. Now, what's the third best-selling Sega CD game worldwide? Well, apparently that honor belongs to Lunar Eternal Blue, or Lunar 2, which happens to be my favorite JRPG of all time, and in my opinion, the best JRPG to ever appear on any Sega platform. And before you ask, yes, I think the original Sega CD versions of both Lunar and Lunar 2 are better than their Saturn, PlayStation, PSP, mobile, and modern counterparts. Answering why would probably really require an entire video, so I'll talk about that in the future sometime. Anyway, the point is, these games are great, and it's not too late to play them today. There are newer patches and quality of life releases that improve on the retail versions of these games, with things like a mixed case font, the removal of some of Working Design's more interesting gameplay choices, and more. So you might want to look for the unworked versions. But whether you play the original versions or the newer unworked versions, these games are both fantastic and worth playing today. The most valuable Sega CD game today is KO Flying Squadron. And we'll end this 11 Facts video in the same way that I nearly always do, with information on what is currently the most valuable game for the system. In this case, a lot of you probably already know this one, it's KO Flying Squadron. At the time of this recording, you can see the game goes for over $6,015 new, about $2,440 complete in box, and a whopping $843 for just the loose disc. So let me tell you a very short story about KO Flying Squadron. I bought KO Flying Squadron used at a Blockbuster bargain bin in either late 95 or early 96 for about $12. I played and enjoyed it back then. It was a decent little cutesy shooter with a fairly good CD soundtrack and decent play mechanics and difficulty. The game was worth essentially nothing in those days, assuming you could even find it for sale anywhere. Overall, it was a nice little above-average hidden gem type game, but nothing spectacular. Anyway, decades later, I saw that KO Flying Squadron had become valuable. I think it had been going for about $300 or so in the early 2000s if I remember right. I decided to make a backup of my own copy myself. And yes, I actually do back up a lot of my own disk images. So I put in the disk in one of my PCs to rip a bin.q file from it. Since then, I'd moved multiple times, and then a year or two ago, things got a little desperate on the old home front here, so I figured I'd finally sell it to make some money. The complete inbox price at the time was about $3,000. I opened the case and gasped. No game! I must have left the disc in the CD drive of whatever computer I'd ripped it from decades earlier. And worse yet, chances are high that I accidentally threw the computer or drive away with that disc still in it. So yep, unless I come across an old computer or CD-ROM drive that I put away in a weird place, I basically threw out a $2,500 to $3,000 game, but I still have the case and instructions and all. Alas, I am a piteous creature. Alrighty folks, let me wrap this up by saying that I think the Sega CD is one of the most unfairly maligned pieces of gaming hardware in the entire history of the industry. It had a sizable library for its fairly short time on the market, and most of its games are not FMV games despite the narrative out there on the good old interwebs. To that end, in a couple of weeks, I'll bring you a video dedicated to showing you a bunch of non-FMV Sega CD games that you maybe didn't know about. I'll give you an extended look at a few things that I showed you here today, and I'll shut my yap at a few points so you can hear the audio. Before that, however, I am going to be back with something different to break things up a bit. I don't want to have too many Sega CD videos one after the other. Alright, so anyway, tell me folks, what do you think? What interesting facts would you have covered about the Sega CD that I left out? Did you learn anything new today? I want to hear all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. It's the only way my little channel here can grow. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through super thanks and channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.